Um, Good afternoon. Before I begin, I just want to extend a heartfelt thanks to the organizers of this event who were gracious in inviting me here. I'm thankful that I have an opportunity to participate in such an important event on such an important yet tragic occasion. It's my first time here in your lovely city of Stockholm, and aside from just being delighted to see the city, I'm also happy to see that in Sweden there seems to exist a network of human rights activists and former political prisoners, and a network of local Swedish politicians and activists who are part of the diaspora. I hope that thanks to events like this, we can actually expand that network further to include those of us who are on the other side of the Atlantic in the US and Canada. There are obviously very large Iranian diaspora populations in those countries, and among them are individuals and groups which are very active politically. So we need to build such links and strengthen such ties among these activists. Ladies and gentlemen, this summer is the 20th anniversary of a massacre that stands without parallel in contemporary Iranian history. It is a grim and tragic anniversary. It is also an anniversary that has largely gone unacknowledged by Iranians and members of the international community. Aside from occasional events like this, which are held in various cities, one generally doesn't hear of major vigils held to commemorate the event. One doesn't hear of the world's major human rights organizations releasing reports to coincide with this anniversary. One generally doesn't hear any talk, except for the occasional disparate voice here and there, talking about obtaining justice in this case. Sadly, one generally doesn't hear anything at all about this crime. What we need now, on this 20th anniversary of the massacre, more than ever, is to shatter this pervasive silence surrounding the 1988 massacre. To do this, to play my part, I want to first recount the story of 1988. The story may be new to some in the audience, but for those of you who are former political prisoners, who bravely endured the barbaric prisons of the Iranian government, who were tortured physically and psychologically, this will be a repetition of what you already know. I apologize for that repetition, but I think it's important to tell and retell that story, not just as an explanation of why we must act, and not just as a way to ensure that a younger generation, my generation, understands the struggle. But we ought to repeat the story also as a form of resistance against the government that has tried since 1988 to bury the crime along with its victims. And this ought to be a resistance against the tendency in the diaspora community, among academics, lawyers, human rights activists, and people from various walks of life, a tendency among them to simply acquiesce in this induced historical amnesia. Telling this story is a resistance against the government that has committed a double crime against each of the political prisoners. The first crime was obviously the gruesome murder, and the second is the effort to completely erase them from the historical narrative. After speaking about the crime, I want to devote some time to assessing it under international criminal law. I want to talk about the elements of the crime and the categories of the perpetrators. And finally, I want to end by speaking about the tasks ahead and the legal and political challenges ahead for those seeking accountability in this case. It is important that another 20 years from now, we don't gather to talk about how the 40th anniversary of the massacre is unacknowledged. Let's hope instead that by that time, there will have been some justice. But that won't be easy, and I want to talk about why that is. So, with that by way of an introduction, let me first begin by discussing what happened in Iran's prisons 20 years ago. Iran's Islamic government had, immediately after the revolution in 1980-81, unleashed a wave of violence and executions. But even after these executions, the prisons remained full of prisoners of every age, gender, political affiliation. Mostly the political prisoners were affiliated with the Mujahideen or were members of political prisoners in the 1980s had not been afforded anything even remotely resembling a fair trial. They were arrested on very vague charges, tortured, and then faced trials that lasted a minute or two. No defense offered, no appeals, no safeguards. And it's also worth pointing out, and I think this is very, very important, that these prisoners in prisons throughout the 1980s were generally in prison for very minor and non-violent offenses, and I put offenses in quotation marks, like selling books and newspapers, attending meetings, organizing solidarity groups, things of that sort. These folks were not involved in armed struggle. In late 1987 and early 1988, the government began a process of re-interrogating and recategorizing prisoners. Prisoners at prisons like Gohardasht and Evin were typically brought, sometimes blindfolded, sometimes not, before panels to be re-questioned. The questions that were asked varied from prison to prison, and they were often based on political affiliation, but generally they would be asked about whether they accepted the legitimacy of the Islamic Republic, whether they'd be willing to publicly condemn their group, and how long their sentence was, and so on. Based on these answers, the prisoners were divided up based on their continued level of resistance and the length of their sentence, their religiosity, and so on. And just as a side note, I ought to mention that when I say prisoners were divided up based on the length of their sentences, something we ought to remember is that a large number of these prisoners had actually served their sentences completely by 1988. So for instance, someone would be arrested in 1980, they would get a 5-year sentence, and one would think that that person ought to be released in 1985, but the government would actually not even honor the rulings of its own kangaroo courts, and they would keep them in prison. Some of the so-called troublemakers, the prisoners that displayed more resistance, were at this time moved from general wards into solitary confinement, and some of the prisoners at this time after this recategorization were moved between wards and between prisons. This unusual reinterrogation really undermines the theory in my mind, the theory posited by many, that the executions that occurred in the summer of '88 were somehow the reaction of a panicked government that had been attacked militarily by an opposition group. In fact, the methodical way in which this reorganization occurred indicates that the government may have been laying the groundwork for such a massacre and was looking for some means of making the process more efficient. A number of former prisoners have pointed out that the reorganization had the effect of disrupting sophisticated communication networks that the prisoners had developed over the years. This may have in fact been part of the massacre preparation. Mid-July of 1988 rolled around, and Iran decided, after having faced several defeats in the battlefield in the last year or two of the war with Iraq, to accept the UN Resolution 598 and to end the war. Khomeini drank from the famous so-called poison chalice. The war was ended. The prisoners thought they were going home. They were very wrong. Shortly after the ceasefire was announced, the military wing of the Mujahideen launched a very ill-conceived attack on Iran's western border and was defeated soundly. Very shortly thereafter, the massacre began. And as an aside, I want to point out, as I just did a moment ago, that I really don't think there is much of a connection between the Mujahideen attack and the executions. I think the connection really is tenuous. On or about July 27th, the Iranian prisons went into lockdown. Visits were suspended, televisions were taken from wards, radio broadcasts were stopped, prisoners were not permitted to visit the infirmary. Basically, all communication between the prisons and the outside world ceased. Initially, the prisoners from left-wing secular parties were isolated and the massacre of the Mujahideen prisoners began. Those prisoners were taken from their cells, and in what must have been someone's idea of a perverse joke, the prisoners were told that they would be meeting with a commission that would grant them amnesty. The prisoners were taken, often blindfolded, and told to line up. When they met the commission, they realized that it was not an amnesty commission. It was, in fact, a commission that would later come to be called the Death Commission by the prisoners. It was comprised of representatives of the judiciary, the prosecutor's office, and the intelligence ministry. The figures on Tehran's commission were diverse, but some of the better-known figures are Jafar Nayeri, Murtaza Eshawi, Ibrahim Raisi, Mustafa Pur Mohammadi. Some have mentioned the name of Ismail Shushtari among the members of this death commission. The commission decided on whether or not a Mujahid prisoner would live or die, often based on one simple question: what political party do you belong to? To answer Mujahideen was to seal one's own fate. The correct answer was Munafiqeen. And for those in the audience that may not know this, the term Munafiqeen is actually a religiously loaded term. It means hypocrite, and it's a pejorative term that the government has often used against the Mujahideen. If a prisoner got past this initial threshold question, then he or she would be asked about his religious views, about his opposition to the government, about his or her willingness to publicly denounce the organization, his or her willingness to give the names of other resistant prisoners, and his willingness to go on missions to clear landmines from the war front. Based on these answers, the Death Commission would decide, by a plurality of votes, whether the prisoner would hang. In Evin, when it was decided that a prisoner was to be executed, he'd be guided to a line on the left side of the hallway, taken to a small room to write a last will, and then taken into the amphitheater to hang. The whole process, from start to finish, was a matter of minutes. The prisoners report that there was chaos in the lead-up to the death chambers, and often prison guards would take prisoners they didn't like and simply put them in the execution line. This is how matters of life and death were decided. During this time when the Mujahideen faced the massacre, the leftist prisoners were generally kept isolated and had no idea what was happening. There were clues about the massacre, however. One prisoner recalls seeing an Afghan prison worker coming in and miming a noose around his neck as a way to signal what was happening. The prisoners interpreted that to mean that perhaps Khomeini had died. Some heard a helicopter that would come twice a week and carry the roving members of the roving death commission. Some got Morse code messages tapped on the prison walls from Mujahideen prisoners about a massacre underway. But the prisoners just simply found this too hyperbolic and too unbelievable. Some in Gohardasht prison saw guards with face masks entering the prison amphitheater, and they would see bodies being taken out of the prison. But they often thought that these were just the bodies of soldiers, Mujahideen soldiers killed in the skirmish at the border. In talking to prisoners and reading their memoirs, one is often struck by the fact that prisoner after prisoner noticed these clues, but did not immediately think that a massacre was underway. To them, it was just too unexpected that such a thing would occur. When the authorities finished with the Mujahideen in late August, they turned to the leftists. Some of the leftist prisoners had caught on to what was happening and were more prepared than the Mujahideen prisoners had been. Some of them gave strategic answers to questions about their political beliefs and their religious beliefs to ensure that they survived. By and large, though, they faced the same type of questioning as the Mujahideen prisoners had faced. And they also faced the same brutality, though the questioning they faced was often a little bit different. It had more of a theological element to it. There was really an effort to decipher whether or not these prisoners were murtad, like apostates, or muharibs, combatants against God. One scholar has actually referred to this as an inquisition in the classic sense of the term, and I really believe that to be the case. Perhaps the only group of prisoners to collectively escape death were leftist female prisoners. The Mujahideen women were mostly found to be combatants against God, and they were hanged. The female leftists, however, were found not to have sufficient agency as women to be deemed as apostates. So, as one commentator has noted, the Iranian government's misogyny, actually in this case, may have ended up saving women's lives. Of course, the female prisoners were subject to horrific floggings and beatings and so on afterwards, and a number simply committed suicide because they couldn't bear it. But they were generally not killed in that wave of executions. After about 3 months of this brutality, the families, who had for months been desperate for information, were notified and told to come and collect their loved ones' belongings. They weren't told about the date of the execution, the method, the burial spot, and they had to agree not to hold funerals or to erect public memorials to their loved ones. In fact, when a representative of the UN appeared in Iran to investigate allegations of human rights abuses, even the very small monuments that the families had built to members of their family were torn down. Immediately after the massacre, the government launched what can only be described as a fairly well-orchestrated denial campaign, in which its representatives spoke to the international media, they spoke to human rights organizations and international organizations, and simply denied that a massacre ever took place. People like Rafsanjani and Khamenei simply said that a few people had been killed, but they were Mujahideen combatants who were involved in the military attack on Iran. Abdullah Nouri, who would later become the darling of the reform movement and a close associate of President Khatami, and who was the interior minister in the 1980s, spoke to the UN and said that a campaign has been organized abroad alleging that invaders captured on the battlefield had been executed en masse, but he went on to simply deny that this had ever occurred. So as I mentioned at the outset, after having told this story, I just want to talk a little bit about the massacre in the framework of international criminal law. Without delving too deeply into technical discussions, I want to point out that the 1988 massacre is almost a textbook definition of crimes against humanity. The concept of crimes against humanity is now firmly established in customary international law. It has a rich jurisprudence that began roughly in the early 20th century and continued through the Nuremberg trials and was really developed by the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. And now the new Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court draws from that jurisprudence and adds to it. Just a word about the elements of crimes against humanity and why I refer to the 1988 case as a textbook case. A crime against humanity needs to be part of a widespread or systematic attack against civilians. This element is intended to distinguish a crime against humanity from a random attack that's not part of a plan or a policy. Widespread means an attack that's massive, frequent, large scale. And a systematic attack, on the other hand, is more qualitative. It points to the organized nature of the act and of the act of violence and the improbability of its random occurrence. The 1988 killings were almost certainly widespread. They were geographically dispersed across the country, and the number of victims is in the thousands, though the exact magnitude is open to debate. And the killings were certainly systematic, and I'll get to that in just a moment. I also want to point out that the attacks were against civilians. The Iranian government has exerted a great deal of effort in trying to link the victims of that massacre to the Mujahideen's military action in 1988. That position is both factually and legally indefensible. Factually, because the prisoners who had been in prison for many years had nothing to do with the attacks. They were far from the battlefield, they were in no position to take part in spying or terrorist activities, and in the case of prisoners not affiliated with the Mujahideen, the prisoners who were affiliated with various left-wing parties, they didn't even belong to a political party that was involved in the battle. The assertion is also legally incorrect because the customary international law is increasingly showing that any person who has laid down his arms is considered a civilian for the purposes of the definition of crimes against humanity. So even assuming that some of these folks were actually captured on the battlefield, they could not have been summarily executed legally. The other important element of a crime against humanity is that it be part of a preconceived policy. There is some debate about the exact contours of this element, but in the 1988 case, it's crystal clear. In establishing that the 1988 murders were part of a preconceived policy, one needs to refer to the memoirs of Ayatollah Montazeri, who has written with incredible clarity on the topic. And for anyone in the room who doesn't know who Ayatollah Montazeri is, he was actually sort of second in command during the time that Khomeini was alive. He was widely expected to be the person that follows Khomeini. But once he spoke out about this massacre and various other issues, he lost that position and subsequently has been placed under house arrest. I mean, to this day, he remains under de facto house arrest. Anyways, in his memoirs, he has indicated that the orders came from the very top, Khomeini himself, and that many in the upper echelons of the government, like Mustafa Ardebili, Ahmad Khomeini, and others, were involved. Who then is responsible for these crimes against humanity? I posit that we have 4 categories of culprits to think about when analyzing these executions. The first group, obviously, is the executioners. The murderers who performed the unlawful act obviously bear criminal responsibility for it. Next in the hierarchy are those who directly ordered or prompted the executions, and this category includes the judges on the death commission or the prison wardens who instigated the killings. Now, thanks to Montazeri's memoirs, some of these figures are fairly well known to us. Nayeri, Ishrawi, Pur Mohammadi, Ibrahim Raisi, others. At the top of this criminal hierarchy are those who participated in the planning of the crime. Montazeri is purposely vague on who these people are. He says that some people came to Khomeini and asked for a letter to execute these political prisoners, but he never really reveals who these people are. But one need only really look at Khomeini's inner circle at that time to figure out who they were. There is a fourth group who bears criminal responsibility for these crimes, and they may sometimes slip one's mind, and it's important that we not forget them. These are government officials who didn't actually order killings or conceive of the policy, but bear criminal responsibility under the doctrine of superior responsibility. These are individuals who had effective command control authority over the perpetrators, who knew or had information that would allow them to know that crimes were being committed and failed to take action. So this actually allows us to look up the chain of command at people who may not have directly sat on the death commission, but who must surely have known of its existence and its gruesome activities. So we look to see who headed the intelligence ministry at the time, and we find Mohammad Reshahri. We find Mustafa Ardebili as the chief justice of Iran's courts. We find Ismail Shushtari as head of Iran's prisons. We find Mousavi Khomeini, who also later reinvented himself as a reformist, acting as Iran's prosecutor general. And we find Khamenei, the current supreme leader, acting as Iran's president at the time. In the Iranian context, though, I should mention, this doctrine of superior responsibility is a bit problematic. Iran has a particularly chaotic power structure, as some of you know, and it's not always entirely clear who has effective command and control over others. So, having addressed all this, I also want to just talk briefly about what it is we should be doing and what political and legal challenges lie ahead. When thinking about the political challenges involved in the pursuit for accountability in the 1988 case, and when thinking about why no one has seriously taken up an investigation of the case, there is an uncomfortable truth to which many in the human rights community will not admit. But it's the giant elephant in the room, so it doesn't make sense not to address it. I think a primary political problem in addressing the issue is that the majority of victims of the massacre belong to a political group that is now looked upon unfavorably by a lot of human rights organizations and by a great many opinion makers. I don't want to delve into a discussion of the arguments for and against the Mujahideen, but looking at this project of obtaining justice, I think one would immediately recognize that the victims are not viewed in the most sympathetic light. And those who want to keep the story buried will constantly point to that fact. They will point to the fact that the organization is labeled as a terrorist organization in various countries. They will point to the fact that human rights groups have criticized this organization for its own human rights actions, for its cult behavior, so on. I don't want to get into the merits of that argument, but we all know that it has salience. And we all know that the unpopularity of victims has something to do with the fact that the world has been silent about this for so long. A second political or strategic problem is that many of the facts of the case are simply shrouded in mystery. It's so difficult to provide a complete narrative of the crimes of that summer when one doesn't even know how many people were killed or who exactly ordered their killing. The story of 1988 is an incredible story, but it's an incredible story with significant gaps in it. A third political problem has to do with the fact that the world's attention at the moment is not focused on human rights. Rather, the attention is almost exclusively on the nuclear issue, on Iran's sponsorship of insurgents in Iraq, and so on. It's hard to get the world to care about a crime that happened virtually in secret that no one's talked about for 20 years. There is a corollary problem here, and it's a problem that's really arisen in the past 8 years or so, I would say, and that's the fact that the wrong people seem to talk about human rights in Iran. There seems to be a real fear in the human rights community, and some of it is warranted, some of it I don't think it is, that to engage with human rights issues, to talk about the 1988 case or similar cases, is to give neoconservatives, especially in the US, ammunition with which they can attack Iran. On the legal front, too, there's no shortage of problems. You know, for those of us who care about international human rights, who care about international legal mechanisms, the last few weeks have been very good weeks. We've seen the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court seeking indictments of Sudan's president. We've seen Radovan Karadzic being caught and handed over to the ICTY at The Hague. But in the Iran case, it's not immediately obvious what institution can actually be really called upon to try anyone accused of these crimes. The Iranian courts are obviously not part of the solution. They are, in fact, very much part of the problem. They are complicit in much of the repression of the Iranian government against Iranian citizens. The International Criminal Court lacks jurisdiction to try the case, both temporal jurisdiction and also territorial jurisdiction. There is no special UN court like the Court for Yugoslavia or the Court for Rwanda, and national courts of other countries are often very reluctant to use notions of universal jurisdiction to try people for crimes that don't have any link to their country. And even if there was a court, we don't have adequate evidence, we don't have defendants to try. We still don't know how many people were killed, as I pointed out. We still don't know who orchestrated their killing. We don't know who has effective command in the Iranian power structure. So all of this talk of obstacles may lead activists like you and lawyers like me and former prisoners and people interested in justice and others to despair. But I don't think that's what's called for. If anything, all the problems I listed should propel us to act. And when I say we need to act, I mean that we must do more than simply come together every year to commemorate the events. Don't get me wrong, commemorations are important. Observing moments of silence is important. Laying flowers, singing songs, these are all important. But these are only the beginning. What we need now, more than ever, is for a group to come together to actually spearhead a demand for accountability. To combat the problem that I alluded to earlier about the unpopularity of victims, such a group needs to ensure that its campaign for justice is non-political and independent of any partisan leanings. This must not be a campaign to support this or that political group. It must be a movement that stays above partisan frays. It must be a movement that argues that demanding justice and accountability is important for all Iranians, not just those with ties to particular parties. Such a group also needs to publicize what happened in 1988 and let people in the world, particularly policymakers, know about it. What we need to do is shift focus onto the massacre by linking it to what we see in Iran today. You know, we have a government that is utterly unresponsive to its people and their demands, and it's a government that continues to repress, torture, and kill its own people. And it's a government that acts irresponsibly on the international stage. It does all these things because there's an entrenched culture of impunity in Iran. It does these things because the people who carry out horrendous acts, as they did in 1988, walk free. And not only do they walk free, they get promoted and they become government ministers. The government does these things because it has so far been accountable to no one. So it's important that we draw the link between that culture of impunity in Iran and the Iranian government's current appalling behavior at home and abroad. Such a group also needs to begin the tough task of gathering evidence. You know, there are human rights documentation centers that do this kind of work. The speaker after me was actually the founders of one such organization. You know, there are organizations like this here in Europe, they're in North America. Unfortunately, the groups don't communicate very well. And as a result, they don't proceed very efficiently. So a group that focuses on the 1988 massacre needs to partner with them and gather evidence before it's been lost. It needs to gather testimony before memories have faded and people have died. And finally, such a group needs to create alliances with other communities who have been in similar situations. I always mention the Chileans and the people of Argentina as examples. Communities that saw military leaders wreak havoc on their country. But the human rights activists in those countries continue to work tirelessly, bravely, and creatively, and have had some notable successes. So, ladies and gentlemen, I sometimes despair about the prospects for success. But then I see Radovan Karadzic in the defendant's box. I see Charles Taylor being tried. I remember Slobodan Milosevic being tried. I remember that Augusto Pinochet's last days were spent in fear of prosecution. I remember that each of these people was thought invincible at the time, but was eventually brought to justice. And when I remember that, I feel encouraged again. A campaign for accountability in the 1988 case requires a serious and sustained effort. It needs people from all walks of life. As I said at the outset, 20 years from now, I hope that we can say that we struggled and eventually won victories in the cause of justice and accountability. I hope that we don't gather to lament our failure to act. I thank you.
Thank you very much for a very detailed and extensive discussion on the matter. I am sure that there will be maybe some questions, but